Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon now. My name is Tamara Martin. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Lindsay, and thank you all for joining us. So a little background about me is that I'm a senior statistical program manager at Bristol Myers Squibb. I am within the innovation and standards group, and I have about 10 years of experience in clinical research. So I've been doing this for a little while, but today I'm going to talk to you about the shift that we are seeing in how AI is used for programming. Specifically, what happens when we stopped prompting these large language models and instead start training them like the domain experts that we are? So what happens, this talk is grounded really in clinical programming, but the core idea is much more broadly than that. So if your work relies on structured specifications or regulated logic or reproducibility, then this approach is going to be really relevant for you. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So large language models are incredibly powerful, but in clinical programming, we do expose their limitations. Before I go any deeper, I want to take a minute to ground this for anyone who may not be from a clinical background. So in drug development, we don't just write code. We translate structured specifications into analysis data sets that are then used for regulatory decisions. So these specifications are typically defined in Excel, and they describe exactly what each variable should be, how it should be derived, and how it traces back to the data source. So this is not just about programming, it's about traceability, reproducibility, and auditability. Now that we have this general purpose LLM into this space, there's a few challenges that are going to show up immediately. First, they're going to hallucinate. For even advanced models, general SAS code may look correct, but it will include some non-existent procedures. So incorrect derivations, logic that breaks on edge cases, and in a regulated environment, almost correct is going to still be wrong. Second, clinical specifications, they're not natural language. They're structured metadata. So think of Excel-based specs like they map directly to code. It's a type of structured spec-to-code relationship that's almost entirely absent from the public training data. Third, SAS itself, SAS itself, it is underrepresented in training data. So even when the models generate valid code, they often miss these conventions and patterns that experienced programmers rely on. And finally, programmers, we don't work in a single environment. We move between SAS and R and VS Code and Jupyter. So any solution has to meet us exactly where we're at. So when you put all of this information together, general purpose AI really does struggle. Finally, for those that work outside of clinical research, if you're in finance or maybe another regulated field, this is very similar to trying to generate some audit-ready code from structured reporting specifications. The expectations for correctness and traceability are going to be just as high, and the gap we're describing is going to be the same. So at BMS, we stepped back and we asked a different question. We said, not how can we prompt these models better, but how can we actually teach them the domain knowledge that we already know? So we didn't start with fine-tuning. We started where most teams are going to start today, prompt engineering. That means that we were giving the model detailed instructions, adding context, and trying to guide it to the right answer. And to be fair, it did work really well for simple tasks, things that were like filtering data sets, writing a quick proc, or generate small snippets of code. But where it started to break down was with those full programs, especially when you read an entire specification and generate that consistent end-to-end logic. So the next step we added in was the retrieval augmented generation, known as RAG. Retrieval go and find the documents, codes, or examples, augmented, add that information to the prompt, and generation. The model uses it to produce a better answer. So here, instead of relying on only a model, we bring in relevant documentation, examples, and even internal code patterns at runtime. So that definitely improved things for us. Overall, it reduced hallucinations, and it helped with consistency. But there was still a fundamental limitation. It was relying on the general purpose model, and that led to some key realizations for us. The model wasn't actually understanding the specification. It was pattern matching and trying to stitch together something that was plausible based off what it had seen before. And that is a big difference. Because in clinical programming, we are not asking for something that is plausible. We're asking for something that's correct, consistent, and aligned with the standards that we use. So that is when we moved into fine-tuning. Instead of telling the model what to do every time, we trained it on real specification to code comparison so that it learned the patterns, the conventions, and the logic ahead of time. So now, when it sees a specification, it doesn't need examples or instructions. It already knows how to approach that problem. So this is where that shift happened. We were asking the model what to do. We went from asking the model what to do to teaching the model how to think beyond or within that domain. So what we built, it wasn't just a model, it was a complete system. That's important because in practice, a model alone doesn't solve the problem. You need the surrounding pieces to make it usable, measurable, and ultimately trustworthy. So we built 4 key components. First, we built a benchmark data set called Clinical Code Bench. It includes nearly 2,400 real clinical specification to code pairs across 49 of our internal BMS studies. This is what gives us both training data and a way to objectively evaluate the performance. Second was the model itself, SASBuddyLM. It was a 7 billion parameter model that has been fine-tuned specifically on clinical programming data. So instead of it being that general purpose, it's specialized for translating specifications into SAS code. Third, we created an interface that was agnostic architecture. So that means that the model wasn't tied to a single tool. You can access it through a SAS macro, which is where we started last year, or through VS Code using an MPC, or through a REST API for automation and integration into pipelines. So fourth, an evaluation framework that was based on execution and not just the syntax. So instead of asking, does our code look correct? We actually run the code against test data sets and then compare those outputs to the expected results. Because ultimately, that is what matters. So know whether the code or specification is correct, but if it produces the right output in the end, when you bring all those pieces together, it allows you to answer a very practical question, which does that code actually work? So at the end of the day, everything starts with data. And you've probably heard that 100 times today. And it's because it's true. It's not the biggest challenge, or it is the biggest challenge that we face, because in clinical research, there is no public data set for clinical specifications paired with code. These assets are going to be protected. They're typically live separately within organizations. So at BMS, we built one. We started with over 100,000 raw specification to code pairs across the 49 clinical studies I mentioned earlier. From there, we went through a multi-step process. We cleaned the data by removing duplicates, backups, or incomplete files. We paired those specifications with the correct programs, sometimes through explicit references, sometimes by intellectually matching within that same study. And then we validated the results. So after all that, only 234 pairs made it into our gold standard tier, which was fully human verified for correctness and reviewed. That number, it's intentionally small. So because in clinical research, the data, it ultimately supports decisions about real patients, real lives. So correctness, it isn't nice to have, it is a requirement at what we do. This highlights something broader in AI. Data curation, it's not just about a pre-processing step, it is foundational to our entire system. Data curation is going to be that active, ongoing process of managing, organizing, cleaning, and enhancing your data through its life cycle so that it ensures accurate, accessible, and reusable for research or for our business purposes. So if you remember one thing from this slide, the quality of the model is determined by the quality of the pairs. In this case, both sides are going to matter for quality. So the specifications you're creating and the code that you're generating, because the model is learning the relationship between the two. So to make this work, we had to rethink how we represent our specifications, because the format you choose is going to directly impact how well your model can understand the problem. Most clinical specifications, like I mentioned earlier, they start in Excel, but Excel isn't something that an LLM can meaningfully interpret. So we had to convert it into a text-based format. Now, standard formats like JSON, that might seem like the obvious choice, but they're actually really inefficient in this type of use case. They repeat structure over and over, which increases your token count and makes it harder for the model to even identify patterns. So instead, we use something called Tune, a token-efficient format specifically designed for LLMs. So the Tune format, think of it like a cleaner version of a spreadsheet, where you define the structure once instead of repeating it over and over. It makes it smaller and more efficient and just easier for that model to understand. Tune does a few important things. It's going to reduce the size from 30 to 60% compared to JSON, and it's going to preserve the full structure of your specification. It's easier for the model to interpret because that schema is defined once and then it's reused. So instead of repeating column names for every row, we now define that structure up front, and then the model can focus on the actual content. So what that model actually sees, but not the Excel spreadsheet that you've created. For my non-clinical audience members, think of this like taking a complex spreadsheet and then converting it into a clean, structured format that AI can reliably reason over. Because at the end of the day, better input leads to better outcome. So we needed a way to measure performance, and building a model, that is one thing, that is one step, but understanding whether it actually works and how it compares to other approaches, that is just as important. So we developed Clinical CodeBench, the first CodeBench of its kind for clinical programming. It included those 2,400 specification to code pairs, spanning across 49 of our internal BMS studies. That was covering both STTM as well as ADAM. But what really makes this valuable is not the size, it's the realism. So the benchmarks reflect that real-world programming data scenarios, not simplified and not synthetic. So that's critical because in research, not all problems are going to be the same. Some tasks are going to be super straightforward, like mapping demographics, for instance. But others involve some more complex derivations, like multiple data sources or nuanced business rules. And beyond that, every single design can introduce its own variability and complexity. So if you want to truly evaluate a model, you have to benchmark it and capture that range. That's exactly what our Clinical CodeBench was designed to do. It gives a consistent, objective way to measure the performance across different models, different approaches, and different levels of complexity. For the architecture, we chose a $7 billion 7 billion parameter model that was very intentional in our decision, not because it's the biggest or it's the most powerful model available, but because it's practical. So the model can run on a single GPU. A single GPU, it's going to be one graphic processing unit, basically a high-performance processor that's designed to handle heavy computations, especially for AI and machine learning. A GPU is going to be like a powerful engine for math and parallel processing. Instead of doing one calculation at a time, like a CPU, it can do thousands at once, which makes it ideal for running the AI models. Now, some of the largest models out there, they require dozens or even hundreds of GPUs to run. The model that we use requires just one. So it's much more practical to deploy within an organization. For an analogy, a CPU is going to be like one of your very smart coworkers, whereas your GPU is going to be all your teams working together doing small tasks in parallel. So it can be deployed within your own infrastructure. And most importantly, your data, it's never going to leave your environment. For organizations working with sensitive or regulated data, that's a major advantage. Now, there's a common misconception that AI, bigger models, is bigger outcomes. In domain-specific problems, that's really not the case. So when you fine-tune a model on the right data, and that data is going to reflect an exact use case, you don't need massive general-purpose models trained on the entire internet. What you need is a model that is relevant. So a model that's going to understand your patterns, your conventions, and most importantly, your edge cases. And when I say an edge case, I mean those less common scenarios that still need to be handled correctly. Things like missing dates or incomplete data, unexpected values, they may not happen often, but if your code doesn't account for them, you're going to get incorrect code or code that won't run at all. And as a programmer, you know how frustrating that is when your code is not set up defensively. For example, let's say a patient, they might not have an end treatment date or a date that might be partially missing. Those edge cases, they need specific handling before you run your code or you're going to miss out on information of adverse events. So instead of relying on scale, we focused on specialization. And that leads to a key takeaway here. Small and specialized can outperform the large and generic models, especially in highly structured, domain-specific worlds like clinical programming. So we made the decision to have an interface that's agnostic architecture. So what does that even mean? It means that the model has multiple entry points. So you can access it through the SAS macro, like last year we talked about SASBuddy macro, through VS Code integration, or through a REST API for automation in those pipelines. Think of REST API as a way for different software systems to talk to each other over the internet or over a network. A REST API, it's going to be like your messenger. You send it requests, for example, like generate SAS code for this specification, and then it's going to send you back a response, like the generated code. The key point is that the model itself, it's not going to change. No matter how you interact with it, you're using the same underlying intelligence. That separation is important. It means that the model, it's not tied to a specific tool or interface. It can fit into whatever environment your team is already using. And as tools continue to evolve, you don't need to retrain your models. You simply connect to those new interfaces. That becomes especially important for your adoption and your scalability. Because in most organizations, we know that different teams prefer different tools. It's easier for you to integrate this into your existing workflow because it's more likely that people will actually use it. So our execution-based evaluation, we didn't base this on how the code looks. We evaluated on whether it actually worked. So we asked a series of very practical questions. Does that code run without errors? Step one. Does it produce an output data set? Does the structure match what we expect, including the variables or the types? And most importantly, are those values correct? This is what our evaluation framework was designed to measure. The framework is a way that you can grade generated code based on what actually happens when you use it and not just how it looks. Moving from does it run to is it fully correct? Think of it like baking a cake. So level 0 is your oven turns on. Level 1 is you actually got a cake at the end. Level 1 is you actually get a cake. Level 2 is that it looks like a cake. Level 3 is it's the right size. Level 4 is it tastes like a cake. Level 5 is it matches your recipe. So the first level focuses on basic functionality. Can the code execute and then produce an output? Then we move into some deeper validation rules. Does the structure align with the specification? Are the row counts reasonable? Are the key variables derived correct? Because in the real world programming, especially in our regulated environments, appearance is not enough. So code can be syntactically correct and still produce those wrong data sets. And if the output is wrong, the code is wrong. For my non-clinical audience members, this is very similar to validating financial outputs. So it's not enough for your script to run successfully. You need to verify your numbers and produce actually correct results. So that is why execution-based evaluation is so important here. So our benchmark is designed to reflect real-world difficulty. We're not just testing simple examples. We're covering a full range of tasks in clinical programming that we actually encounter. So at a basic level, that is including things like subject level demographic data sets, where that work is going to be mostly straightforward mapping. Then at the intermediate level, you start to see some more realistic complexities. It's going to include things like derivations, such as handling those partial dates we talked about earlier in adverse events, which does require logic and interpretation. At an advanced level, you're dealing with some more complex programming tasks, such as time to event analysis. That's going to be used for your primary endpoint. These require multiple steps and careful logic and just a strong understanding of your study design. Then at that expert level, we include things like your basic data structure data sets, where you may be carrying your last observation forward, or you're handling some windowing logic. These involve use cases, interpretation, manipulation, and nuanced rules that are often study specific. So as clinical programmers, we know that our day-to-day work, it's gonna fall somewhere within that intermediate range, but a full range of complexity matters when we evaluate these models. Because if the model that performs well on simple tasks struggles with that logic that's more complex, it doesn't matter in the end. So that's exactly why what we measure matters. So this is really where it starts to get interesting. Here you can see a concrete example of how the general purpose model falls short. So if you look at both output codes, they look syntactically correct. They run. They look reasonable at first glance, but only one of these codes are going to be clinically correct. So SASBuddyLM outputs includes several different important details. First, it's going to handle your missing data explicitly, which is going to prevent your invalid comparisons. It's going to account for ongoing treatment by correctly handling missing end dates. And it's going to follow some of our proper flagging conventions, where you would see a missing value left blank rather than forcing something like an in. So these are not obvious rules to the general model. They are not things that you would necessarily pick up from documentation, but they are learned patterns from our real clinical programmers and real programming practices. This is exactly where that domain-specific training makes a difference, because the goal is not just that you generate code that runs. The goal is that you generate code that behaves correctly under real-world conditions and is defensively set up. So this is the distinction that I want to highlight. The difference here is code that runs and code that you can actually trust. So now let's see where this falls in practice. These are some real execution-based scores using our L0 to L5 framework, not approximate measures, but real execution-based scores, not subjective grading. These numbers are on a scale from 0 to 1. So 1 is going to be your perfect match. That code runs and it's fully correct output. That 0 is going to be it's completely wrong or it fails early. 0.82 to 0.86 is high quality, mostly correct outputs. At the top, you're going to see Claude Opus with RAG, which sets the quality ceiling at 0.86. Just below that, you'll see Claude Sonnet with RAG, which comes in at 0.82. And what's important here is that SASBuddyLM, our 7 billion fine-tuned model, it also comes in just below Claude Sonnet at 0.82. Same quality tier, but without a retrieval layer and without relying on a cloud API, meaning you aren't sending your data out externally. That's the key point. It is not about beating these frontier models. It's about achieving comparable performance in a much more controlled and efficient environment, especially for our teams where data privacy, infrastructure, and cost are the real constraints. So now let's look at the cost versus the quality perspective. On this chart, the x-axis, that's going to be your cost, but on a log scale, so that each step to the right is a big jump in cost and not just a small increase. Then your y-axis is going to be your quality. So the higher you go up, the more correct your generated code is when you actually run it. The log scale is going to prevent the expensive models like Opus from compressing everything else visually. It's going to highlight that going from half a cent to 5 cents to 50 cents, it's a massive jump, not just small ones. So it's going to help justify your efficient frontier argument. The points highlighted are what we call that efficient frontier, which means you get the best trade-offs when you're getting the most quality for cost. In the far right, you have that Claude Opus with RAG. It's the highest quality, but it also is the highest cost at 88 cents per run, so that's per code generation. Sonnet with RAG sits just below that at 16 cents. Then on the far left, that starred point with the red circle, that's SASBuddy. It is roughly 0.82 quality at half a cent to run. And once it's deployed, that cost is essentially 0. So our trade-off becomes very clear. To move from SASBuddyLM to Opus with RAG, you're paying significantly more per run. And your data, it leaves your environment. So for some teams, that is absolutely worth it. But for others, especially in our regulated environments, it's not a viable option. So that's the point. It's not about one solution winning. It's about understanding those trade-offs. So here is the honest answer. The right approach, it depends on your constraints. Fine-tuning tends to win when your data can't leave your environment, when you're working in highly regulated space, or maybe when cost per run, it really matters, especially when you're trying to scale within your organization. On the other hand, RAG with frontier models, combining that retrieval with models like Claude or GPT, it tends to win when cloud is an option, or your code base is constantly evolving, or when you want to benefit from that ongoing improvements in these underlying frontier models. Because these models, we know they're going to keep getting better whether we retrain them or not. Both of these are valid engineering decisions. So we're not here to say that one is universally better. What we're really contributing is everything around the decision. A benchmark that is going to measure performance, such as the clinical code bench, and a format that makes specs usable by our models, Tune, and an evaluation framework based on execution and not appearance. So these pieces, they work together, whether you're fine-tuning or using RAG or a combination of both. So it isn't about competing with your frontier models, it's about helping teams make the right choice for their environment. So what does this mean for you? First, it's not about replacing programmers. It is about changing how we work. For me personally, it resonates. As a programmer, I'll be honest, I am efficient in ways that many programmers tend to be. I do not want to start from scratch. I do not want to have to write something new. I want to be able to reuse patterns or build on existing code that I've used because ultimately I want to move faster. This is exactly what that model is going to do and add value. It gives you a high quality first draft, something that you can review, you can refine, and you can build on. As a more senior level programmer, that matters even more. My time, it's spent focusing on complex logic or edge cases, ensuring consistency across our studies, or defining and maintaining validation standards across our organization. So those are the areas where our human expertise, it's critical. Another important point is the deployment. That model, it's gonna run entirely on your own infrastructure. So your data, it gets to stay within your organization. You maintain full control over how it's used. When you step back, this is not about what you're already doing, both for clinical and non-clinical programmers. It's not about automation, replacing people. Sorry, it is about accelerating the work that you're already doing for our non-clinical and clinical programmers. It's going to allow you to spend less time on repetition and then more time on the work that actually requires our expertise and judgment. So I'll leave you with this. Prompting, that's what got us starting. Fine-tuning is what makes it reliable. And structured, regulated domains, that distinction, it really does matter. Because at the end of the day, it is not about generating code only. It is about generating code that is correct, consistent, and ultimately trustworthy. I would be happy to take questions, and I think that they have a mic too.
Mic here, so if you've got a question, put your hand up and I'll come running. If you can wait to get to you so that everyone that's watching on demand can hear your question. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Nice presentation.
Thanks.
So just like SASBuddyLM, did you guys do something like SAS adversarial LM to QC the work that BuddyLM is doing?
We did not. We did it all internally. And we did it all internally with assigned programmers that were actually human validating our work. Yeah.
So in your development, first of all, fantastic job. You
Hey,
did
Paul.
great. Take a good breath. You did wonderful. So how long did it take to you to get to SASBuddy version 1, and then from SASBuddy 1 to the final version that you currently have right now? And how many people did you have working on that?
So it's been about 2 years, but that's not been consistent development because we're in innovation and we...
Innovation.
Squirrel, yeah. So we're always like working on new things and developing new things. The initial setup, I mean, you see the contributors. There was maybe 2 other people outside of that. And then once we really sat down and got past that SASBuddy macro setup, we were really looking into, is this going to work internally for us as an LM? And ultimately, we did sit down with, we sat down with our IT department and decided, can we use something that is going to have an external cloud or a cloud environment for our data, where we can use that LLM that's based off those frontier models, or do we have to stick with something with SASBuddy? That's answering a question you didn't ask, but we ultimately decided to use the frontier models with RAG.
Thank you.
So about 2 years to make that decision,
Yeah,
give or
about
take.
right, about right.
Thank you again. The presentation was great. My question's more about the quality of code, and how are you guys using this also to the reverse augmentation, where you're going back and looking at the data, ensuring your data scientists are using consistent code methods and code books by using this tool as well, to say this is how we operate?
I don't think they have reverse augmented it, but I do think that is a great point, because within being in standards and innovation, we want everyone to have that same baseline for what they're starting with, because whatever the team is producing, let's say it's SDTM or it's Atom, that information is not only going into their final CSR or their study-specific deliveries. We also have tools that we generate within BMS that then rely on that data to feed into them for other use cases, whether that be dashboards, or another tool we have, CDEX, or it could be risk monitoring, whatever it may be. We do try to make sure that we are living within a standard framework of our structure and data set, but we haven't used SASBuddy for that purpose.
So in your RAG frontier model approach, I may have missed it. So the RAG, what's the vector database? Is the same like spec program pairs?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
And that honestly can be used for anything. I mean, I think when you start using RAG as a way to support how you're using your LLMs, even these frontier models, it could be for something as simple as, help me define all baseline characteristics across a therapeutic area, and you start feeding in different protocols or different, SAPs and things like this, and it can help hone in that information without you having to go and do it yourself or be knowledgeable in that TA.
Anyone else? Any more questions for Tamara? No? All good? Okay, perfect. So if we can give Tamara a great hand of appreciation.